There is a lot going on domestically, but the political chessboard internationally has been completely upended at the same time. What does this mean for Australia as we enter an election campaign?
I think politics here at the moment feels a bit like, in a cartoon when the cartoon character runs off the cliff and then their legs keep on going and keep on going, so you can look at the scared look on their face, and then suddenly they stop defying gravity and fall straight down. It's like we're in that kind of gravity-defying moment right now. It's like our election campaign is rolling on almost as if this huge upheaval isn't happening to our security, to our economy, to our defence. Everything is being upended. And our election campaign, we're talking about, should we have a $5 a week tax cut, or should maybe we cut fuel excise for a year? I mean, this stuff is bigger than that.
Yeah, I'm not sure if chessboard's quite the right analogy for what's going on at the moment. It's more like some kind of more destructive game, I think.
It feels like chessboard suggests a bit of strategy in it, or,
Strategy
intelligence,
and control, and
it doesn't feel like that.
Predictability.
It's mind-blowing what's going on in America and the impact that is having on other countries. It's very hard for smaller countries, which is basically everyone, almost every other country in the world, certainly Australia, to work out what to do in so many different areas, that it's kind of understandable why the election campaign, as it gets underway, is focused on the small things that we can control, the budget to a point, rather than trying to think about these much bigger, intractable, impossible questions in many ways to answer about what we should do about all this, because it is so big and looming over everyone. But at the same time, like Lenore says, it's kind of...
We're in denial.
We're in denial, yeah, exactly.
I think even the bits that we can control in the budget, like defence spending, it wasn't really a major factor in the budget. There was a lot more ink expended about tax cuts, about health, NDIS, all those things, than talking about, well, what are we going to do here? Do we need to boost defence spending to 3% or redirect some? Or what about AUKUS? None of that was really, in any detail. And even the opposition didn't really talk about it either.
But I think that's partly because the things you can do in one budget to address an entire recalibration of the whole global geopolitical situation are extremely limited. Like, whatever they've done,
they are limited.
It's going to be
you also had like the ridiculous situation of Adam Bandt out there saying we should buy missiles rather than...
And we're not even having the conversation. We're not even talking about it. It's like the election campaign is proceeding, and we're not... Yes, it's a big conversation. We're not going to resolve it straight away, but we're not even having it. It's like we're pretending it's not there, except for a few words like, wow, it's volatile.
Can't say that the cartoon character running off a cliff analogy is hugely comforting. But I do think it's accurate. It's hard to know where to start with the news that came out of the US this week, but one of the biggest story was about top White House officials accidentally texting top secret war plans to a journalist. That's an extraordinary story in its own right, obviously, but should Australia be concerned by this?
Yeah. Yep, we definitely should be. I mean, this was the Vice President, the Defence Secretary, the Secretary of State, the Director of National Intelligence, using commercials chat app Signal to convene and discuss plans to bomb the Houthis. I think, there's lots of ramifications of this for Australia. One of them is we in the US are part of the Five Eyes intelligence sharing group, along with Britain, Canada, New Zealand, which presumes that all our intelligence, all our signals should be shared with one another, except in exceptional circumstances. But if they're so slipshod with intelligence that they don't even notice that some rando journalist is in their war chat, why surely we should think about whether we continue to share intelligence with them. And that's before you even get up to the things that they are now doing with intelligence unilaterally, like, we're just going to suspend intelligence sharing with Ukraine all of a sudden. Other countries are raising questions about this, like the head of Canada's intelligence agency saying, this is really worrying. We really need to think about sharing intelligence with them. I think we do too. I mean, I think there are other questions that this raises for Australia, but in terms of intelligence sharing, we need to think about it because they don't seem to care. I
think the really worrying thing is, they don't care. There's been no accountability. Michael Waltz said, oh, look, I take full responsibility, but that doesn't involve resigning or saying we're not going to do this anymore. So, there have been intelligence leaks, intelligence failures in the past, but in the past there has been accountability about it. When we had the diplomatic cables leaks, there was a lot of questions about how this happened, about who's responsible. But this time around, it seems like nothing to see here.
Well,
Let's
they're
all
not even
move on.
taking it
No.
seriously. First they said it was a hoax. Well, clearly it's not, because the Houthis were actually bombed exactly when it said they would. And then Trump said Hegseth had nothing to do with it, when the texts are right there with him saying what kind of missiles and exactly when. I mean, they're not even taking the leak or the breach seriously.
It was the only glitch in 2 months. That's what he said from Mike Waltz. And it turned out not to be a serious one, according to Trump. I mean, how much more serious can you get than that? It's mind-blowing.
But I think the content of those messages raised questions as well, because the point of the bombings against the Houthis, who are backed by Iran, was to keep international shipping trade routes open. JD Vance was in that group chat arguing against the bombings or to delay them, because he saw it as bailing Europe out, because Europe uses the shipping lanes more than the US does, so they should pay more to keep them open than the US does. And then Hegseth responded, I fully share your loathing of European freeloading. It's pathetic, with pathetic in all caps. Now, our main concern in the South China Sea, the main danger of any military conflict in our region between the US and China over Taiwan or over anything else for that matter, is shipping routes that account for 90% of our exports. That's the main thing we want to protect through our security alliance with the US. That's what our Strategic Defence Review saw as the main danger, not an invasion, but the fact that China would, from a distance, target our trade through using the shipping routes. And here we had the US Vice President and the US Defence Secretary discussing the defence of shipping routes in terms of some economic ledger about who's going to benefit from it most. I mean, that isn't how we assumed security alliances would work.
Publicly, the Labor government is very clearly trying to distance itself from the spectre of Trump, but do you think there would be background considerations about the reliability of our alliance with the US?
I think there'd be a great deal of consideration going on within private conversations in Canberra between senior politicians, between intelligence chiefs, between defence chiefs. You would think that, you would hope that this is being discussed at the highest levels. You know, we're not going to tear up the ANZUS Treaty overnight. We're not going to go it alone on defence, but you know, there does need to be some thought put into, you know, hedging our bets a little bit, I reckon. And there's a lot of people who have done some really good thinking on this already in public. Sam Roggeveen from Lowy Institute published a really interesting essay called The Echidna Strategy that looked at how we could sort of invest in what the US would call porcupine strategy for Taiwan, you know, really defending our homeland in a way, rather than tying our lot in with the US in a potential war with China in the South China Sea.
Another expert who we interviewed recently for a story on this, Alan Patience from Melbourne Uni, was advocating building better relations in the region, as you know, previous prime ministers have done, Paul Keating particularly, saying we need to enmesh ourselves more in Asia. But I mean, that raises its own questions about the stability of countries in the region as well, and not just countries that are very close to us, but I think there's an effect from Trump here as well, particularly when you look at like the two of the countries he named were South Korea and Japan. In South Korea, they're currently undergoing their own kind of upheaval of a sort of proto-authoritarian leader who tried to impose martial laws, then subsequently been impeached, and his supporters have been on the streets. You know, there's a very divisive atmosphere there, and they are literally using rhetoric derived from the US situation, stop the steal rhetoric, particularly in his support. So there's a kind of feedback loop going on here in the world. They're feeding back into other countries, including ones in our region. It's not as simple as just, oh, we've got these other countries who think alike to us on our doorstep who we can switch to from the US. There's a whole lot of other turbulence going on that makes it more complicated.
And the other, I mean, we should mention that the budget did redirect some aid towards the region to make up for the withdrawal of US aid. But the other question, I mean, I agree with Patrick about we should be looking at how we hedge things. But that raises questions again about AUKUS, because AUKUS enmeshes us inextricably with US defence material, US defence decision making, and makes it much harder for us to act in any way independently.
And it also has such a huge price tag.
Yeah.
That there's an opportunity cost there. You can't do both.
No.
$43 billion for one submarine. You do have to ask those questions about, well, what else could we be doing with this enormous sum of money?
I think, when Trump was re-elected, there was, I think, a legitimate pause while people looked at how the new administration would pan out. But I really think we're getting to a point where it is panning out in such a unilateral and unpredictable and unreliable way that, in my view, we should really be rethinking AUKUS, because I don't think we're going to get any submarines for the $360 billion that we have on the table. And inability to extricate ourselves from anything that President Trump might do is a problem. And the fact that he sees everything in these transactional terms, he doesn't even think multilaterally, is a problem. I mean, I would really like, at the very least, to see a proper, informed, realistic debate about that.
But also, it's not just Trump. It's not just the next 4 years. It's what comes after that. Like, if the Democrats won the next presidential election...
Well, if there is another presidential election.
Assuming elections go according to how they've gone previously in the US and there was a change of government, that still doesn't guarantee stability in the US for the medium term. Like, it could all flip back again 4 years after that. So it's kind of become... It's not just for now, right? It's like a medium-term, long-term problem for Australia and all the other countries that have relied on US alliances until now.
We've talked about all this turmoil before we've even got to the economy, which is, the global economy as well as obviously our domestic economy. Is it becoming harder for the government to sell confidence in their economic message when Trump at any time could upend anything and is upending everything?
Well, that was the whole juxtaposition in the budget this week, right? Like, on the one hand, the government was quite justifiably saying the economy is turning the corner and things are getting a bit better. On the other hand, it had to say, yeah, but there's all this volatility bearing down on us that could have a big effect. And they really couldn't articulate what that effect would be, because we don't know what he's going to do. What is he going to do on Liberation Day? Will there be tariffs against us or will there not? Like, we really don't know. Somewhere deep in the budget papers, there was a calculation that 25% tariffs on all manufactured goods would take more than 0.1 of a percentage point off our growth, and that would be way worse, double or quadruple, if we retaliated. So clearly that's an indication that they're thinking about it. And I don't know how they could have been more detailed than that, given that we really don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah, it's pretty hard if you're Treasury to map things out over even the forward estimates over the next 4 years, let alone in the longer term. But there were some pretty scary graphs in there about the potential impact of a trade war. Australia is an incredibly trade-exposed nation. We rely on trade for our prosperity, and our major trading partner is China, really. So any potential trade war between the US and China is going to have devastating effects on the Australian economy.
I mean, I guess if you weren't about to have an election and you were the Treasury, you might have banked a bit more of that money so that you got the deficit down and set yourself up a bit more securely. But we do have an election, and that's where we are.
And some of our top universities and scientific organisations have even felt the creeping influence of Trump as well. How big of an impact is this going to have on our cultural institutions as well?
I mean, yes, cultural institutions, but I think primarily scientific research, health research. If they're being threatened with, for example, cuts to ones that do climate science, and the research that is done in Australian universities, a lot of it is partially funded from the US. There's not much they can do. As the Education Minister, Jason Clare, said, it's for the US to decide what its research priorities are. And right at the forefront of many people's concerns for the future is the climate, and the research that goes into it is absolutely vital to trying to formulate plans for mitigating the effects of climate change. So perhaps an unexpected outcome of the Trump administration that people hadn't thought about so much, but it's a really serious one, and a very difficult one for our universities to address.
It seems like such an own goal as well, because the US and China are locked in this strategic race to command scientific and tech research. And Donna Liu, our science reporter, did an interesting story last year that for the first time China has overtaken the US in the amount of scientific papers it publishes. But here is the Trump administration cutting science and tech research, basically. it beggars belief, I reckon.
And also sometimes for sort of quite capricious reasons, like are the collaborating organisations complying with his gender edicts, which, looks like foreign interference to me.
So as we watch the US descend into authoritarianism, is there a moment where our relationship with them simply has to change?
Yeah, I think we're at that moment. At least in terms of considering, and I guess that's what I was saying at the beginning, that I think both of the major parties are really scared to have an open-ended, full and frank debate about what's going on going into an election campaign. It's a hard conversation, and it's not one you want to have in an election campaign governed by sound bites. But whoever wins the election campaign, I think it is a discussion that has to happen pretty much pronto.
I think descent into authoritarianism, we are seeing elements of it, but it's not over. There are institutions in America that are strong, but are being severely tested at the moment. And Trump has stacked courts with his own appointees.
And ignored them.
And ignored court orders as well. But I think, there is elements of courts trying to stand their ground against the administration. I think there will be a lot that we will see over, the next few years.
I think it's interesting that some leaders around the world who are standing up to him, like in Canada, are really gaining in popularity. I think people are, we know from our own readership numbers, people are really interested and concerned about these discussions. And, I do think that having that kind of a discussion after the election in a sensible way is probably what people would want the new government to do.
Now it's time for what we can't get out of our head this week. Lenore, what was that for you?
Following on our conversation, I've been thinking a lot about what's happening to the media in the United States and the sort of clampdown that's happening from the Trump administration. George Clooney, who I think is a very good actor, is in the stage version of the film Good Night and Good Luck, which was the movie where he plays the journalist Edward R. Murrow, who took part in that big TV showdown with Joseph McCarthy. And in an interview about this new role he's playing, he drew parallels between those events and the difficulties that reporters in the US are facing right now, like the defamation settlement that ABC News had to have with Trump, the voter interference suit that Trump filed against CBS. I mean, there is just such pressure on the media in the States. And Trump's response on Truth Social was that Clooney was, quote, a second-rate movie star, which really addresses the issue, right?
Well, I have to agree with your first point that he is actually a very good actor.
Quite.
And Patrick, what can't you get out of your head this week?
Mine is a bit of an old man rant about the declining standards
Come on,
of English language.
We want
in
an
this
old
country.
man rant. Bring it on.
So the Prime Minister of Australia, this week in Parliament used the phrase "delulu with no salulu" to criticise the opposition's economic plan. For those of you who don't spend their days on TikTok
Or with teenagers.
That basically means delusional with no solution. But all I have to say on the matter is this shit really has to stop. It's bad. We can't have the Prime Minister saying stuff like this. He's got to have some dignity, really.
I think it was Adair with a podcast interviewee that he said he'd use that phrase in Parliament.
We don't need our Prime Minister doing dares.
No, I'm not suggesting we do.
No, he'll be quoting song lyrics before we know it.
And Mike, what can't you get out of your head this week?
So mine is just a sort of very left field story about a miniature dachshund called Valerie, who we reported this week went missing 16 months ago on Kangaroo Island in South Australia, and had been Valerie only weighs less than 4 kilos. So it had been assumed that Valerie had died, sadly, but has now been seen again. And a year after she went missing, her owners heard that via social media that she's been spotted, and now there's been more sightings. They believe that she's alive. They've set up traps to try to lure her out of hiding. But my favourite part of this story was that we published an amazing photo that clearly shows Valerie running away in a field about a kilometre away from the camera, taken on a phone with a white circle around this black dot in the middle of the field.
Isn't there some suggestion that Valerie's amazing survival might have had some sort of help from humans somewhere along the line?
Very possible, I think. And I should add that we don't necessarily support feral dogs being on the loose in Kangaroo Islands wildlife, but we do hope that Valerie is recovered
But
safe and
apparently
well.
they do have fairly. Went down a bit of a rabbit hole, or a
That's in the hole.
Yeah, but they do have quite good survival skills because they were for hunting badgers, and they're quite good at getting kind of small animals out of holes, and they can.
Well, that doesn't bode well for kangaroo.
No,
Well,
Thank you so much for having us end on a non-grim note, Mike. And thank you for joining me this week.
Thanks, Bridie.
Thank you, Lenore.
thanks, Bridie.
And thank you, Patrick.
Thanks, Bridie.